Right, a minute or two overdue, but we're due to move on to exciting topic of leases and electric vehicles with Robin and David. Thank you very much, Mark. As I said, Robin, I'd like an electric vehicle. Can you get me one, please?
I'll sort you one out, Giles. Yeah, there's a bit of a commission involved, but we can talk about that off screen. So, good morning, everyone. From the south coast, not such a nice day here today, and hopefully a bit nice where you are, David.
Yeah, not too bad, Robin. Yeah, slightly drizzly, but yeah, can't complain.
Okay, so the slides are up. This session's going to cover two interlinked areas that most other academy trusts don't really stray into: company cars and leasing arrangements. I guess there's not many finance professionals working in academy trusts that are familiar with running a company car scheme for their employees. And indeed, it's not that many years ago, teachers' pay and conditions didn't allow the use of such schemes. Salary sacrifice was available just for things such as childcare vouchers and cycle to work schemes. In terms of leasing, this has usually been limited to things like photocopiers, with other types of leasing often avoided, partly due to the fear of inadvertently entering into a finance lease and therefore potentially an unauthorized borrowing arrangement. The thought of leasing cars for its employees hasn't traditionally been on the radar for the average trust. But in contrast to this, the 2023 Academy Trust Handbook specifically states that ESFA approval isn't required for electric vehicle salary sacrifice schemes, as long as no liability falls on the trust if an employee doesn't fulfill their contractual obligations with the scheme provider. So basically, if the employee were to leave, the trust shouldn't be left with having to fulfill the rest of the lease obligations. So is it something worth looking at for trusts? I think the options become more of a real one at a time when recently hasn't there been a time where we've got the ongoing budgetary pressures. Part of the 6.5% pay award announced in July will be funded by the government, but the trusts still need to find the other 3.5% from existing funds, as they were expected to have budgeted for this sort of increase anyway. Whether this 6.5% award still below inflation levels for the last couple of years, whether that's going to solve the problem of the current teacher shortage remains to be seen, but I think the answer is that it's not going to. On another topic, the past couple of years have seen some very tangible examples of the effects of climate change on our planet. The UK's very hot summer last year wasn't really repeated this year, although we still had some records broken in September. But many parts of Europe have suffered more record temperatures. And we've also recently seen the spectacular and tragic impact of wildfires in a number of the Greek islands and in Hawaii, and only last week, the flooding in Libya. So all corporate organizations now, including academy trusts, are being held to account for their contribution to these issues, whether it's through the reporting requirements that are placed upon them, or more prevalently now, from employees and potential employees wanting to know what they're going to do about it to help, or actually what they're doing that's hindering. So over to you, David.
Yeah, next slide, please, Fran. So yeah, thank you, Robin, for that introduction. So the electric vehicle scheme potentially offers several compelling benefits for both employers and employees. And on this slide, we've just noted four good reasons to potentially implement such a scheme. First one on the slide, reducing carbon footprint. EVs help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and minimize environmental impacts of travel. EVs produce zero exhaust pipe emissions, which obviously contributes to cleaner air and a healthier environment. So by promoting the use of electric vehicles, your trust could play a significant role in addressing climate change and contributing to a sustainable future. Improving environmental, social and governance credentials, ESG. It's the next good reason on the slide. ESG considerations have become increasingly important for employers, and adopting an EV scheme showcases your trust commitment to sustainability and responsible employer practices. This can enhance your reputation, attract socially conscious staff, and align your trust with global efforts to combat climate change. And then the third point on there, recruitment and retention. Offering an EV scheme demonstrates your trust's dedication to employee well-being and modern values. Many employees are environmentally conscious and are looking for workplaces that share these values. So providing access to electric vehicles can be an attractive perk for both potential recruits and current employees, therefore enhancing your trust's ability to attract and retain talent potentially. The final point on the slide, cost savings for employees and employer. Electric vehicles tend to have low operational and maintenance costs compared to traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So by providing an EV scheme, you empower your employees to save on fuel and maintenance expenses. Additionally, offering charging facilities at the workplace can be a cost-effective solution. Electricity is generally cheaper than petrol or diesel. So yeah, incorporating an EV scheme into your trust policies not only aligns with broader sustainability goals, but also offers tangible advantages in terms of the environmental impact, trust reputation, employee satisfaction and cost management. So potentially a win-win situation for all stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks, David. Next slide, please, Fran. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a number of compelling arguments for trusts to take a look at an electric vehicle scheme for their staff. Just taking a look at the current environment of EVs at the moment in the UK, and there's been a notable increase in recent years in sales. Looking back to 2018, so 5 years ago, there were 60,000 new EVs sold. That covers both fully electric vehicles, which just run from the battery, and also plug-in hybrid vehicles, which also have a conventional engine that can kick in when it's needed. The mix back in 2018 was roughly a quarter fully electric and 3/4 hybrids. So I think it was about 17,000 fully electric vehicles just 5 years ago. Figures for last year, 2022, there were a total of 369,000 sales. So that's an increase of more than 6 times. And the mix had completely flipped. So 3/4 of those vehicles last year were fully electric, around 267,000 vehicles. With the number of EVs rapidly increasing, we obviously need the infrastructure to improve. That has been constantly improving. As of July 23, so just a couple of months ago, the latest figures I could find, there were 44,000 public charging points in the UK, more than 4 times as many as in 2018. And this, of course, is in addition to the private facilities EV owners may have at their homes or available to them at their places of work. While the time taken to fully charge an EV is still an issue, typically more than an hour, I think it's only really an issue if you're having to undertake a long journey and break up that journey to charge. There's also a number of apps that are getting smarter at making you aware of the availability of chargers on your journey. So I think it's got to be fair to say that the infrastructure is better now than it's ever been, and it's only going to get better as time goes on. Cost of an EV obviously is a key factor. It's coming down, albeit slowly. Around at the moment, the average cost of a non-luxury EV vehicle, so just taking your typical family car, say, is around about £33,000, which is still significantly higher than the equivalent non-electric vehicle, which is around £22,000. And government policy is also a relevant factor in the way the market's moving. One of the headline strategies for the UK, as you probably know, is that after 2030, there'll be a ban on the sale of new petrol or diesel cars unless they have the capability to drive significant distances on zero emissions. And from 2035, all new cars have to be fully zero emission at the tailpipe. So regardless of your views, or you're weighing up the financial cost or benefit, it looks like EV ownership is eventually going to become the only option open to us.
Thanks, Robin. Next slide. Thank you, Brian. So yeah, if we are considering implementing an EV scheme, just need to consider the two different types of leases. So just cover the difference between operating and finance lease on this slide. Schools, I'm sure we're aware, should generally only enter into operating leases. So understanding the main difference between a finance lease and operating lease is essential. An operating lease generally has a shorter duration than the working life of the equipment. Under an operating lease, the leasing company, the lessor, retains risks and rewards of ownership, and it will also retain an investment in the equipment being leased, known as the residual value. And you wouldn't own the equipment at the end of the agreement. Conversely, a finance lease usually runs for all or a substantial proportion of the equipment's estimated working life. Under a finance lease, the lessor transfers the risks and rewards of ownership of the equipment to the lessee. So yeah, the distinction falls that leases that do not meet the operating lease criteria will generally be finance leases. Can be a grey area, and if it's not, if it's not really clear from the outset, looking at those definitions just set out, there are other tests and questions to consider. For example, we might look at, is the lease term for the major part of the economic life of the asset, even if title is not transferred? If the answer to that is yes, probably going to be a finance lease. We might look at the inception of the lease. Does the net present value of the minimum lease payments amount to at least substantially all of the fair value of the leased asset? And again, if the answer to that is yes, looking like a finance lease. Other questions and tests we might look at: if the lessee is entitled to cancel the lease, are the lessor's losses associated with the cancellation borne by the lessee? Again, if the answer to that is yes, pointing towards a finance lease. And also, does the lessee have the ability to continue to lease for a secondary period at a rent that is substantially lower than the market rent? And again, if that's coming out, that's a yes answer, pointing towards a finance lease. So yeah, just setting out some of the tests and things we need to consider when determining whether we're entering into a finance or an operating lease. And just at the bottom of the slide here, just put quite a simple example when looking at a set of computers. If the school, for example, was to lease computers for a period of 3 years, at the end of the lease term, the computers would be returned to the lessor. School would not assume ownership of the computers, and the lease is for non-core equipment, then that's looking like an operating lease. However, if the school was to lease computers for a period of 5 years, at the end of the lease term, the school has the option to purchase the computers for nominal amounts. That would be considered a finance lease because it transfers risks and rewards of ownership to the school. So yeah, just a recap there on operating versus finance leases.
Thanks, David. And I think we can see from that where a typical sort of car lease arrangement, you're looking at a 3 or 4 year lease where you wouldn't expect to be covering the full value of the vehicle or using it for its full useful economic life. So we should generally be looking at operating lease arrangements here. So just to give a case study now on a salary sacrifice arrangement and how it could work for an employee with an electric vehicle. The numbers are quite attractive. All the figures in the example include VAT on the basis that it can't be reclaimed, although it may be wholly or partially recoverable depending on individual circumstances. Also note that the costs may count towards the VAT registration threshold, so you need to take individual advice on this matter. So we're going to look at a nice new Kia Niro. It's a recent addition to the world of EVs and a sensible and practical family car, according to a review I found. List price is 36,545. Thanks, Fran, you went a bit too soon then. So not at the bottom of the range. but it's a good option as a family car. And if you want to do 10,000 miles a year, the monthly leasing charge will be around about £520. So I'm going to keep you on your toes now, Frank, because there's a few slides to flick through quickly. But next one, please. So £520 is the salary sacrifice per month. You won't pay income tax on that because you've sacrificed that salary. So a basic rate taxpayer at 20% is going to save £104. They'll also save £62.40 of national insurance. So total saving then there of £166 per month. However, you will have to pay a benefit in kind charge on the company car. The next slide. So the good news is that while the benefit in kind charge is based on the percentage of the list price of the car, which we saw was £36,500, the relevant percentage for electric cars at the moment is only 2%. So the monthly benefit in kind is going to come out at £60.91 per month. That's the benefit in kind. You then pay tax on that at 20% for a basic rate taxpayer. So they're going to pay £12.18 per month in tax. Next slide, please. So the net effect of that, total tax and NIC saved £166. Total tax suffered on the benefit in kind, £12. So a total saving of £154 on your lease cost of £520. That works out at just under 30% of the cost is saved. And as you can see there, the annual savings, £1,850 for the individual. So quite attractive. Next slide. So as the employer, we look at it from the employer's point of view, that £520 of salary that's been sacrificed, you don't have to pay employers NIC on that. There's a saving of £71.76 per month or £861 per annum. Now there will be a cost in administering the car scheme. You'll be paying somebody to run that scheme for you generally, but that should be less than the annual saving. And also you got the benefit of a happier and greener employee, hopefully.
That's great, thanks, Robin. Yeah, the next slide just further highlights the benefit, the better benefit in kind benefit of an electric versus a petrol car. So just following on from Robin's example there. So yeah, the tax charge, the benefit in kind on a company car is calculated as follows. We work out the P11D value by applying a CO2 emission percentage to the car's list price, and we multiply that by the P11D value by the income, by the rate at which you pay income tax, which is likely to be 20 or 40%. So the key thing is the lower emissions rate that are applied to electric vehicles and are much more beneficial than petrol or diesel vehicles. In the example below, we can see that a petrol or diesel car can attract a CO2 emission rate of up to 37%. I mean, that's at the extreme, but it can be that high versus an electric vehicle, which is currently just 2%. So yeah, if we look at an example of a car with a list price of £30,000, we can see in the table below the difference in the P11D value and therefore the tax that the employee pays. With a petrol vehicle at the upper end of the CO2 emission rate of 37%, the P11D value would be 11,100, and tax on that at 20% would be 2,200. Tax at 40% would be 4,400, compared to the electric vehicle with a CO2 emission rate of just 2%. P11D value comes right down to 600 quid. Tax on that at 20%, 120 quid. Tax at 40%, 240 quid. So yeah, potentially massive tax savings for the electric vehicle.
There's huge differences there. I think now we've whet your appetite. I think it's time to to mention the leasing process, just a few comments on that. As I say, you'd probably outsource the scheme anyway, but there's a few things to be made aware of. About a year ago, the ESFA published some updated guidance for academy trusts on leasing. Section 2 of that guidance gives some sound advice on the process. Before you enter into a leasing agreement, make sure you and the employees understand all the costs that are involved. There's the headline monthly figure for the lease cost of the vehicle. Many arrangements also include things like insurance and maintenance as part of the package, but there may be other charges that aren't immediately obvious, such as where you exceed the agreed annual mileage figure. You need to know what that's going to cost you and really just fully understand what you're signing up for. The lease period is also quite important. There may well be a minimum period under the scheme. Our examples were based on a 3-year lease. The employee needs to be happy with the length of lease they're entering into. If, for example, they were planning to start a family in the near future, then entering into a 4-year lease on a Mini might not be the right thing for them to do. The contract also needs to be clear on where the burden for paying the monthly cost falls should the employee leave. As I mentioned earlier, this should sit with the employee and not have that burden falling on the trust. Need to know what happens at the end of the lease. Is there an option if the employee wants to extend that lease, to buy the vehicle, or do you just hand it back? That's another area where there could be some surprise costs arising. Lease companies can be really strict on charging for any damage to the vehicle. I know from experience that even some quite superficial damage can be, it's inevitable over a 3 or 4 year period, and they can make quite significant charges for that. And coming back to the maintenance package, how comprehensive is that? Are there things not covered that you and the employee should be aware of up front to avoid any potential excitement or ill feeling later on? Back to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Next slide just highlights that there are various grants and incentives available to support the cost and installation of charging points for EVs. Put a couple of examples on there. The EV charge point grant that can provide funding for up to 75% towards the cost of installing EV smart charge points at domestic properties across the UK. And the workplace charging scheme, voucher-based scheme that provides support towards upfront costs of the purchase and installation of EV charge points for eligible businesses, charities and public sector organisations. I've put a link on the slide there for further information. And obviously anything like this, we need to consider that, you need to consider the practicalities of your particular premises in terms of energy supply and space, etc. So yeah, a couple of examples of support out there and a link for further information.
Okay, thanks, David. Just wanted to quickly mention some changes that are coming into place. IFRS 16 applies to large organisations at the moment, where operating leases and finance leases, David's talked about the distinction. In the future, for larger organisations, they're going to be treated as the same. So operating leases will sit on the balance sheet the same as finance leases do. Those changes in the rules are going to cascade down to smaller organisations over time. So I think at some point in the future, we will see academy trusts having to undertake to follow these rules. It's unlikely to be something to worry about in the next year or two. And of course, when those changes are coming into play, we will make sure that you're aware of them. So I think just a quick summary.
Yeah, next slide. Thanks, Fran. Yeah, thanks, Robin. So yeah, just to summarise what Robin and I have talked about, the current landscape underpinning the EV scheme and climate change. We've looked at the potential benefits of an EV scheme. We've recapped on the difference between operating and finance leases. We've given some examples of the tax advantages of electric vehicles, the leasing process, and also some potential grant help out there related to EVs. So yeah, that's that's mine and Robin's section of the presentation. I don't think there's any questions. So back to Giles. I think that might be covered.
Thank you very much, guys. That's really thought-provoking. I think that the biggest thing, I think that the biggest sentence that came out of that for me was that someone saves a third of the cost on these things. I mean, that's the potential win, isn't it? And it's complicated, and there's bits that you do need to take advice on. For instance, the operating against finance lease, that's an accounting question, so run it past your auditors if you're not sure.
I think the VAT as well, Giles. That position.
Yeah, right. There are
complicated.
VAT potential implications, particularly in an academy that's not VAT registered, that you do need to take advice on. And I just get someone else to look over your tax sums as well.